Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to cover some of the issues in the news for about a half an hour. Then we're going to be talking with Tom New. He is the interim president and chief executive officer for Wycliffe. Yesterday, you might remember, we talked a little bit about the idea of the Great Commission, and one of the things I mentioned is translations. So we'll talk a little bit about Bible translations, what's happening there, the expansion of the gospel, and the opportunity for every person on this planet to read the Bible in his or her own language. So we'll get to that a little bit later this hour. Next hour, as I've been mentioning, we have Shannon Bream with us. She is the anchor of Fox News at night, also the chief legal correspondent, a graduate of Liberty University, also having a law degree from Florida State University, and an individual that we've certainly appreciated. We'll be talking about her new book, The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today. I think you will appreciate that conversation, and we'll learn quite a bit. It's a very interesting book, well done, and actually putting some of these women in the Bible in a context I've really never seen before. And so I think you will appreciate that. If you go to our website, you're going to see that I've posted quite a number of articles. And one of the first ones kind of gives you an overview for what we're going to talk about for about a half an hour. Our friend Al Perotta called it Baseball, Boycotts, and Easter Bunnies. Okay, so that gives you the range of things we'll talk about. The first one, which I'll focus on a little bit, is, of course, the so-called dust-up over Major League Baseball's decision to pull the All-Star game out of Atlanta and send it to Denver. And, of course, even there, you've had all sorts of people raising questions. One of those is an individual who's been on this program with us many times before, Ken Blackwell. By the way, African-American, but does that matter? Well, you have to talk about that when you get into the race issues and all the rest. And nevertheless, also a shareholder of the Cincinnati Reds. And I thought it was interesting because what he's talking about now is the so-called Big Red Machine. When we talk about baseball, not necessarily talking about Cincinnati Reds. We're talking about communist China. So that's, he was probably in the best position. First of all, African-American. Second of all, shareholder of the Cincinnati Reds, to talk about what might have changed the name of the Big Red Machine. And, of course, you have a series of other things. And even Jonathan Turley, you've heard me quote from him before. Again, an individual wouldn't necessarily agree with many of the things we talk about on this program, but nevertheless a lawyer and a law professor at George Washington University, who nevertheless is scratching his head saying, okay, All-Star Game's going to be playing at Coors Field, again, the beer, Coors Field in Denver. And yet, if I look at the numbers, he's saying Denver, Colorado, and of course the state of Colorado actually also requires voter ID like Georgia does. It actually has fewer voting days than Georgia does. And it also has a much greater percentage of Anglos, of white people. So if nothing else, by the logic of course, President Biden, Colorado's law is also Jim Crow on steroids, and then somebody had to say, and weed. So anyway, I had to throw that in. Anyway, it's kind of a fun joke. But you might say, what are people in baseball saying? And one of those individuals is Fay Vincent. Now, if you follow baseball, like many of us around the table here, you might say, Fay Vincent, that sounds familiar. Yes, he was the commissioner of baseball in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So here is a former commissioner of baseball criticizing the current commissioner of baseball. You with me on this? Okay. I'll only read a little of this, but first of all, he said he was really concerned about trying to use muscle to change some kind of political policy. And he said, this muscle of financial power is a tactic that's been used for some time. As a matter of fact, the word boycott. Anybody know where the word boycott comes from? Well, it actually comes from an attempt to actually address a man by the name of Charles Cunningham Boycott. And that goes all the way back to something that happened in Ireland. So that's where the word comes from his last name. It was an attempt to deal with him. It turned out that boycotts are usually an act of desperation, largely unsuccessful. And by the way, in that case, they were unsuccessful trying to root him out. But nevertheless, the point that the commissioner of baseball in the past has said is that this midsummer all-star game is an exhibition game that benefits really only the city where it's played. He says that Denver will be the new host. The players will get paid the same no matter where the game played. Major League Baseball will get the same television revenue. The only people been hurt by this would be the workers and vendors at Atlanta's stadium, which is interesting because if you go and look at two interviews with Joe Biden, the first one when he was actually asked about this came from, again, an individual, Sage Steele. Should the All-Star game be moved? You have him making a comment about this is Jim Crow on steroids, and probably it's a good thing to do, and all the rest, and that people won't be able to get water when they're sitting in line. Of course, that's wrong. That they'll close the polling places at 5 o'clock. No, that's wrong, too. But nevertheless, it said all that. Well, then, just recently, he was asked, Mr. President, do you think the Masters golf tournament should be moved out of Georgia? And he says something about Jim Crow, but then almost immediately says, if you move it out of Georgia, the people who need it the most, the people who are making hourly wages, they're the ones that might get hurt. Now, explain this to me. It was not a concern to hurt the individuals that work at the Atlanta Stadium, but it is of concern to hurt the people who work for wages at the Masters in, Augusta. Help me this out. And, of course, that's the whole point. The lack of consistency on some of this is pretty amazing. And so, anyway, Fay Vincent, who is, of course, the former commissioner of baseball, said that, look, Major League Baseball can't become a weapon in the culture wars. I agree. It cannot be a hostage for one political party or ideology. Again, we agree. It can't only be for the rich or the poor. It can't be for one race. And then he goes, and as it was until 1947. Good point. Baseball must always stand above politics and its dark elements of corruption, greed, and sordid selfishness. It can't go wrong by standing for national greatness. And then he uses an example from the 2006 Duke lacrosse case as an example of where people sometimes made some really bad mistakes based upon hearsay evidence. So, nevertheless, the issue of baseball has certainly been one that is quite controversial. And so this brings me to another point that is now being made as well, because also in that first article, it talks about the fact that we have a problem with what has happened at 60 Minutes. And again, Al Perota points out that, there's bending the truth, then there's breaking it in two. And that's what CBS did when they actually, in 60 Minutes, claimed that Governor Ron DeSantis pushed to have COVID-19 vaccines given to the wealthy before the poor, and that he contrived to have Publix, a food store chain, because they donated to his campaign in a pay-to-play particular situation. But then reminds us, and we'll talk about this after the break, that all sorts of people, not just Republicans, but Democrats, not just individuals that in certain parts of the county, but even Publix themselves are saying, this is a hit piece, and none of it is accurate. And as a matter of fact, some of us wanted to go on camera to make sure you didn't have this miscommunication and this basically now being called flat out lie. And so we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about that, because one of the other articles I point out is Ron DeSantis and the media. Why are they going after him? Well, Guy Benson thinks he has some answers. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The pandemic and subsequent lockdowns in 2020 have been devastating to life and livelihoods, but some think it provides a model for what must be done in the future to address the problem of climate change. Some see it as a test run for the new climate-driven economy. That was essentially the argument at the UK Climate Assembly that met last year. One speaker noted that in order to deal with the threat of the virus, the government had to act because they had no choice in the matter. With climate change, they need to act in the same way. A former UN climate chief proposed that government should actually converge the solutions, at least the financial solutions to coronavirus, to the financial solutions for climate. She warned that what we cannot afford to do is to jump out of the frying pan of COVID and into the raging fire of climate change. The problem for these radical environmentalists is selling the idea of permanent climate lockdowns to people already weary of COVID lockdowns. Although Americans say they want action on climate change, they have shown little interest in paying for it. The Biden administration proposed spending the equivalent of $1,500 per American, but the latest Washington Post survey discovered that half the population was unwilling to pay even $24. Of course, it's even debatable whether voters really believe we should aggressively tackle climate change. A recent Gallup poll showed that a quarter wanted action on the pandemic, but only 3% mentioned climate change and the environment as their key concern. Perhaps that is why one European economist admitted that you could not achieve the climate goals currently being proposed without a certain degree of eco-dictatorship. Climate lockdowns might be just the first step of environmental coercion. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that the first article I've posted here, baseball boycotts and Easter bunnies. Talked about baseball, the boycotts. I mentioned just a little bit, which we'll get into in just a minute, about 60 Minutes, which has become quite a scandal because, let's face it, there are some institutions in the media that certainly have been able to generate a great deal of respect. You go back to some of the greats in journalism, and you can certainly see some of that as well. And even more recently, whether it was ABC News Nightline or whether it was 60 Minutes, again, we would find things that we would obviously disagree with, that was the case. But in the tradition of Edward R. Murrow and a variety of other people that were kind of seen as the great individuals of media, there have also been some various programs, Face the Nation, Meet the Press, some of those that you've always seen with some kind of level of respect, which now, interestingly enough, find themselves being criticized, I think, roundly, because even though we do say oftentimes that journalism has certainly gone and taken a wrong direction, you always expect one or two of the journalistic icons to do a better job. It'd be like finding that Edward R. Murrow or maybe Walter Cronkite or Ted Koppel with ABC News was lying all the time. You go, what? I mean, we've always come to sort of trust those institutions. 60 Minutes was somewhat like that, but not lately. And so we'll get into some of this. But again, the broader issue, which we'll talk about in our second article today, is why is everybody coming after Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida? I mean, we have 50 governors. Why him? Why does he get so much media attention? We'll talk about that in just a minute. But as I am leaving the first article, baseball boycotts and Easter bunnies, you might say, okay, I got the baseball, I got the boycotts, I got the 60 Minutes. What's the Easter bunny? Well, that's because there's been a controversy. It's a small flap, but nevertheless, when it came time for the Easter bunny to arrive and for us to have the Easter egg roll and all the things, President Joe Biden could not mention the word Jesus Christ, just couldn't come up with that, So in the Easter message, Jesus Christ doesn't get mentioned. The bunny does. And I like it. Al Perota says, look, we didn't need Biden, CBS, or the Easter bunny to tell us he has risen. And he says, speaking of the Easter bunny, the fuzzy fellow made his traditional visit to the White House Monday, and he was wearing a mask. Nothing better than health virtue signaling from a bunny whose main task is loading children up with sugar. So anyway, got to have fun with that one on that as well. But let's get on to the next article, because Guy Benson has really tried to explain this. You get a sense that after a while there are particular targets that the press likes to go after. Those of you that remember the 1990s, the favorite target was Dan Quayle. When you get to the 21st century, especially by the time you get to the 2008 election, the favorite target was, of course, Sarah Palin. And we know kind of how that game gets played. But the target right now, without a doubt, is Governor Ron DeSantis. And Guy Benson, in the second article here, spends a little bit of time explaining that there is no close second. You have more targets, more misinformation, kind of more hit pieces coming after him than anyone else. And so Guy Benson argues that it's a trifecta of bitterness and fear. He said, first of all, Governor Ron DeSantis wasn't supposed to win in 2018, but did anyway, denying journalists an emotionally satisfying storyline about Trumpism and race in a crucial battleground state. Strike one. Then he's proven them wrong repeatedly on COVID governance, which they are unable to process in a healthy or constructive way. Strike two. And perhaps more importantly, he's a growing threat against Democrats' hold on power in the future. If he wins re-election in the Sunshine State and Donald Trump decides against running again, he'll instantly vault into the upper echelon of 2024 contenders, perhaps with a unique capacity to unite different elements of the center-right coalition. He's also demonstrated the ability to build broad appeal, including among independents and Democrats. Strike three. Take him out. That's just, of course, the first page of 3 pages of tweets and Twitter comments and back and forth and a variety of others. But I think it just illustrates again that this 60 Minutes piece maybe was something that illustrates only so well an inability to look at the facts and try to do anything that looks fair. And so later in the article, Guy Benson points out that it seems as if CBS is distancing itself from 60 Minutes report, which has been widely criticized, he says, as a hit piece against the governor, Ron DeSantis, a Republican, by members of both parties. The report, which he says, which aired Sunday, outlined a pay-for-play scheme, which we just talked about, and critics blasted the report for deceptive editing, which omitted the comments by Ron DeSantis' explanation for the vaccine strategy, and omission of the public donations to Democrats, and all sorts of broadcasting misinformation that was even being called out by many Florida liberals, including some office holders that are Democrats. And so he concludes that paragraph by saying, the next day, however, there was no mention of the 60 Minutes report on CBS This Morning or CBS Evening News, according to the transcripts available. So it does seem to me that this has nevertheless been a real significant stain in the reputation of 60 Minutes. But The other article that I was hoping to post, and it maybe should have been put up there, but I'll just mention it, comes from Charles Cook, because he points out that one of the biggest problems that the media, what used to be called the mainstream media, I'm really doubting how mainstream it is, but the media is suffering from is just this complete inability to sometimes say, I think we made a mistake. And he uses an example by quoting from Axios. Now, I appreciate some of the work that Axios has done. They're the ones that actually have broken some really important stories that we've talked about here on Point of View. But here, this is what Axios said about this controversy of the governor in 60 Minutes. They said, quote, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Trump ally with his eyes on the White House, is dialing up a dispute with 60 Minutes, seizing on a juicy chance to ingratiate himself with the GOP base by bashing the media. And Charlie Cook says, that's the story, is it? That DeSantis is seizing on CBS world-class dishonesty? The issue here is what? His reaction to being so brazenly lied about? The need to know is that he's annoyed by the press attempt to deliberately spread baseless conspiracy theories, that he might bash those who did it, and that he's being accorded a juicy chance to highlight bad behavior. And he says, if nothing else, this illustrates the point. This inability to say, you know what, I think we didn't do a very good job, or at least the ability for people other than 60 Minutes and networks other than CBS saying, I think that one is a little bit beyond the pale and we need to try harder. But no, just the steadfast inability to say, we made a mistake. And we need to maybe try to rectify that. It will be fascinating for all of us to maybe sit down and watch 60 Minutes next Sunday and see if there is even a little bit of a mea culpa, maybe just a little bit of an apology, maybe there were some other things that we should have done. Because if there isn't, then it will illustrate all the more that we want to hold anybody in politics to a very high standard. And matter of fact, maybe even an illogical standard and an unfair standard, but we won't hold ourselves to the same standard, and I think you can see where that takes us. Well, in just a minute, we're going to focus a little bit of time and attention on some other topics, but let me just mention that you might want to go to the website to find these first two articles. A third one by Cal Thomas, which I haven't had a chance to get to, Take Me Out of the Ball Game. That was kind of fun. Another one looking at that whole issue of Major League Baseball. But as you go there, you'll find all three articles. You'll find an opportunity for you, if you haven't already contacted your senator about the Equality Act. That's still on our website, although we will be changing that soon because of some other things coming up. And most importantly, my Viewpoints commentary today changes every single day. This one's on the climate lockdown. There are quite a number of individuals, more of them in Europe than in the United States, but some in Europe that are saying, you know what? This lockdown for the pandemic was a perfect test run for now calling for a lockdown to save the climate. And if you want to understand how serious some of these individuals are, I would encourage you to read the piece because it's really striking, because I end with an individual who was a European economist saying, we recognize that not everybody's going to go for the lockdown, so we're going to need some degree of eco-dictatorship. And so I'd encourage you to read that because it gives you some facts and figures and some quotes that should concern you. And it illustrates, again, as we get into probably next week, some more conversation about this issue of climate change, why we are so concerned about that issue. We'll take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention about half an hour from now, we're going to have Shannon Bream with us, and we'll be talking with her about her new book. And, of course, you have perhaps seen her as anchor on Fox News The Night, as well as the chief legal correspondent for Fox News Channel. And so we'll be talking with her. And you might remember yesterday when we were talking with Doug Cobb. He is, of course, with Finishing the Task, and we even talked about his book, And Then the End Shall Come, The Completion of the Great Commission and 9 Other Clues that Jesus is Coming Soon. One of the conversations we had was about Bible translation and how, whether it is church planting, whether it's reaching out to not only unreached people groups, but even the uncommitted, and maybe even the unexplored groups and things of that nature, that is certainly one of those things that we talked about yesterday. But we also said that today we'd be spending some time talking about this issue of Bible translation, as we've done, and how, in some respects, we are closing in on this seemingly elusive goal of providing the Bible, or at least parts of the Bible, in the languages of the world. And so in order to give you a little bit of an understanding of that, we thought we would go to Dr. Tim Nye. He is interim president and chief executive officer of Wycliffe Associates, individual that holds a PhD in biblical studies. He's helped national Bible translators and, of course, had people from Wycliffe Associates on the program. So, Dr. Tim Nye, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you for the invitation, and it is a pleasure to be joining you today.
Let's see if we can talk about this, because when we were talking yesterday with Douglas Cobb, of course, his book talks about all these different goals that different organizations are setting and kind of a plan to reach various groups by 2022, to have translations and various kinds of churches established by 2030 and 35. It is amazing to me how many different aspects of the body of Christ are all kind of seeing that within maybe some people listening right now's lifetime, we might be able to actually accomplish something that looks like the Great Commission. Can you speak to that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to. We at Wycliffe Associates, our vision for the last 20 years has been to see God's Word reached every heart language of the world. Our vision statement is very clear: a Bible in every language by 2025. And, years ago, I was with a different organization doing church planting, and we looked at that and thought, how on earth is this going to take place? Well, those who crafted that message initially and whatnot said something very important, and we still believe that to be very true. Unless the church, unless God's people actually take this on, it will never happen. And what we are seeing in our initiatives and our efforts is that's exactly what's happening. In the last 5 years in particular, we've had the privilege of working closely with local church leaders around the world and seeing them step up. They're actually taking on the ownership of Bible translation and carrying that work forward.
Let me just mention that we have a link to wycliffeassociates.org, and there you can see the goal of a Bible in every language by 2025. But then also, let's talk about progress. If these numbers are accurate, 751 translations in progress, 478 completed New Testaments. And so it does seem to me that you are making very good progress, and it almost seems to be increasing and intensifying. What's going on?
Yeah, so basically what we are experiencing in our efforts is some fundamental foundational work has gone on in the pioneering efforts of those who've gone before us. And we are also seeing, local church leaders that have grown up, have become established, hungering for God's Word, and actually being able to take it on. We've actually been, for the last 5 years, taking very serious this whole idea of the last words of Jesus that he gave to his disciples and ultimately to us, to go make disciples and teach them to observe all things. And I like to add on to that, even Bible translation. Mm-hmm. So we're definitely seeing a movement that we'd like to talk about. But even in this COVID season, for example, this last year, when all of our plans basically we had to put on hold, we saw the church leaders stepping up and carrying on the work in ways that we've dreamt and prayed for. So that's what we're seeing: church leaders rising up and actually carrying forward the work, not just for themselves. I have several friends in the field that I've spent time with, broken bread with, and prayed with, who are actively teaching others to do the same.
Let's, if we can, talk about this idea of accelerating Bible translation. Matter of fact, I have one article here also about satellite internet connections and some of that, which we'll get to in just a minute. But
Sure.
You have a kind of a different way of looking at Bible translation. I think if I were to go out and interview 5 or 6 individuals that are Christians that maybe have heard about Bible translation, they say, well, yes, we support a missionary in our church, and he or she goes out and spends years learning the language and spends years trying to eventually translate the language, and then checks it out, and eventually they issue a new translation. But you have found some ways in which you can accelerate that. Can you explain that?
I'd be happy to. I actually was one of those missionaries who was trained in church planting and had an introduction to Bible translation very early on, my wife and I, in our ministry experience. And so you're absolutely right. The things that we've known for the last 60, 70, even 100 years in the area and the world of Bible translation, it was going to be folks like us who, had advanced degrees and or training and skill sets to go in, basically give our lives an entire lifetime to see a New Testament translated. And the beauty of the body of Christ, as I've expressed with those who've gone on before us to lay that foundation and that work, we have seasoned Christian leaders in churches who hunger for God's word, and they're in the best position to actually carry that work on. Many of them know more than just their heart language, so they speak a language of wider communication. Some of them have had biblical training and things of that nature. And when we go and we share with them how to approach Bible translation, how they can actually engage themselves, I mean, first of all, they're kind of apprehensive in that, hey, this is God's word. How could we possibly do this? But as we share with them the tools and some of the methods that we've implemented, they catch on and they're able to do it much quicker than any of us would be able to do from the outside. They know the culture. They grew up there. They know the customs. They know the religious practices. And more importantly, they're the experts in their language. So it's a perfect recipe.
Yeah, they're speaking their native language. They already understand it, and all they have to do is take some of those biblical concepts. I've been reading about what is called BTACs, which stands for Bible Translation Acceleration Kits. And it seems to me that that's another aspect of that as well. And, of course, I just mentioned a minute ago that Wycliffe Associates have been providing satellite internet connections and technology because, again, that link provides all sorts of opportunities, not only to access the broader resources, but also to again, accelerate Bible translation. But can people find out more about these Bible translation acceleration kits?
Absolutely. First, we have information posted on our website regarding the kits at wycliffeassociates.org. But just in brief, those translation acceleration kits that you're describing are exactly that. These are for some of the most remote locations on Earth, places that technology hasn't really reached yet. And I know there's a huge push to make satellite connectivity available to every place on the planet, and that's awesome. In fact, without the technology that we have today, the acceleration that we've experienced so far would not be quite as great. But there are still those regions and places, friends that I have in Indonesia, for example, in that island nation, where it takes days just to get there, and they do not have dependable power, nor do they have the infrastructure to access the internet. And these translation acceleration kits provide them with the modem, as well as a solar panel and the battery and the things that are required to keep that equipment up and running. We also provide along with that, a translation tablet or laptop. We're moving to laptops for giving access to all of the translation tools whether they have a spoken language or a written language, or whether they do sign language, that they can actually do the work with the tools that we provide them and have access to a plethora of unlocked content and resources that we put together for them to use.
Incredible.
So not only do they do the translation, but they can do the quality checking on site as they go.
Let's take a break. But again, I wanted you to hear this. Last 2 days, we've been talking about some things that I hope would be an encouragement to you. You may want to pass it on to other people inside your church. We'll talk more about how you can get involved right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about Wycliffe Associates. Let me just mention, this is just one aspect of this incredible movement of Bible translation. I've been reading about a group called Illuminations, which also includes, American Bible Society and Seed Company and Pioneer Bible Translators and Wycliffe translators and a number of others have been involved in that project. But we're focusing right at the moment on Wycliffe Associates, and in particular wanted you to know about this idea of Bible translation acceleration kits. And Dr. Tim Nye is with us, and I thought it was interesting because most of these are needed in remote areas. Our conversation yesterday talked about the fact that we still have not only unreached people groups, but even unengaged groups that are so isolated and so remote that they have, in many cases, never even had a chance to hear about the gospel. Well, the same kind of thing is happening here because some of these places places where you want to have a heart language are in incredibly remote areas where there aren't really, obviously there's no internet service, and so you have to address all of those kinds of things as well. Then let me just get your comments, because we always think about Bible translation being on paper. Okay, well, let's think about this for a minute. In some of these regions, you have incredibly harsh weather, humidity, flooding, even insects. So the idea of now using these laptops and being able to communicate back and forth and to have ultimately, if you will, a hard copy, which is more than paper copy, just illustrates the kind of challenge that you're facing right now in the 21st century. Can you kind of speak to that?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. Pen and paper or pencil and paper in most of the cases where we have had workshops initially definitely present a challenge for use, access, and or longevity for those scriptures. So our team has put together tools on these computers and whatnot that they can do the translation work. And through that uplink, for those who have access to internet and those who make use of the BTACs, they can then upload their content, if you will, to a cloud repository where that information is preserved. Not only is it safe from the environment, but it's also safe for those who work in very, very hostile
that was the other point,
regions of the world.
Yes.
So they can do their translation work in the privacy of their homes, in various locations that they would consider to be prudent and safe, and as well as preserve the work in the event that it's lost to whatever, whether it be the elements or whether it be to hostile people towards the gospel coming in and confiscating it and things of that nature. So yeah, we've created a cloud repository and made it possible for those texts to be captured, to be saved, and to be ultimately output in formats that make sense for those in the local communities. Some still really love and desire to have a printed copy of the scriptures. And for those places, we also work to help them with the printing. We have print-on-demand units and things of that nature that we also can partner with them to help provide for that need. In other locations, they're oral-only cultures, and therefore the translation work is not just done through typing in the text, but doing what we're doing right now. It's speaking into the microphone, if you will, and capturing that oral representation of God's word and preserving it and being able to output it to an app, for example, that they can use on devices that fit their environment.
Pretty exciting time that we find ourselves in the 21st century. We have a link to wycliffeassociates.org, and it seems to me, Tim, that there are a couple of people that might be saying, it might be good to have one of you or some of your associates maybe come and speak in a church, talk about missions, talk about some of the exciting things that are happening in Bible translation, and that is something which this last year, as we well know, hasn't happened, but I think we're starting to come out of some of the lockdown, and that's a possibility. Also, there are a number of people that might say, well, this is interesting. I, might want to come alongside and maybe invest in this Bible translation, or maybe spend some money and help you get another one of those Bible translation acceleration kits to an indigenous tribe. So how can people partner with you?
Sure, that's an excellent question. Well, we for sure love to have folks reach out to us. On our website, we have different ways to engage. We have lots of ministry opportunities for different ones to partner with us. Updating tools, we constantly are doing that. Creating additional content and resources to give church leaders everything they need to make sure that they're producing quality scriptures. And for those who want to give, we definitely have an online giving option there. And our BTAC units cost roughly $2,500 to provide per unit into a remote location. So those opportunities are there for giving as well.
One other thing I thought I'd just mention, which is people go to wycliffeassociates.org, they're going to find something that makes them kind of wrinkle their brow a little bit. Why would Muslims want Bible translation? But it says, even though it doesn't seem to make sense, a Muslim community leader is fighting to keep Bible translation moving in an isolated language group. That one, I think we need to explain, if for no other reason, because it illustrates that even though we talk about the hostility of the Bible, we do find that sometimes there's local leaders that actually are making it possible, aren't they?
There are indeed, and I had that exact same experience firsthand traveling in one of the South Asian countries. I was working with a group of pastors who have, different religious groups and whatnot within their communities, stronger religious groups in their communities. And we asked, so you have the New Testament in your language now. We were there helping them do quality checking and teaching them how to use our resources. And so they said, yeah, so our community leaders are so excited about the Bible translation efforts, and they're actually giving to it and helping us keep it moving forward. And I had to, it took me back a bit. So I asked them, so can we clarify what I think I just heard you say? I thought I just heard you say these leaders who are otherwise opposed to Christianity, opposed to the gospel message, I thought you just said that they are actually excited about the Bible translation project and are giving to it and helping it move forward. And they're like, well, that's absolutely right. I'm like, how is that even possible? It doesn't even make sense to me how that is possible. And their response was, well, you have to understand, in our context, we're not even considered a people. And this is the first piece of any type of literature that we have in our language, and that means something to our community and to all the communities around us.
And that's something.
So it's amazing that just that cultural nuance there is an inroad for scriptures to be brought into the community, and it's changing lives. Those same pastors and church leaders described how, husbands are reading the scriptures at home with their wives, and the wives are teaching their children how to read using these Bibles. It's amazing.
It is. Well, Tim, I appreciate you joining with us. And again, we have a link to wycliffeassociates.org. Dr. Tim Nye has been with us. You can find out more about him and about Wycliffe Associates by going to our website, pointofview.net. So thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to share some of this encouraging news to our listeners. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kirby, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, Shannon Bream will be with us, and we'll talk about her new book. And if you'd like to join with us at some point, you're free to do so. You're going to find all sorts of articles that we have posted here today. I mentioned those in the first half. If you'd like to find out more about Wycliffe Associates, that's there as well. And if you'd like to know about the new book by Shannon Bream, which I'm pretty sure you're going to be able to find in any bookstore, but if you'd like to get it, it is available both on hardback and Kindle, and so we'll have a chance to hear from her, and I hope that'll be an encouragement to you. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, when you talk to people that maybe don't know a lot about the Bible, and especially if you talk about women, they might think, well, women really play a very small, kind of secondary role in the Bible. They may not even be aware of the fact that Jesus elevated various women in a variety of ways, which we can talk about. But even when you talk among Christians, oftentimes the women in the Bible are used to illustrate a point. You know, Abraham and Sarah, the founding of a nation, or Hannah, maybe when you're talking about infertility, or Mary and Martha in terms of priorities, or even when you talk about Esther. I mean, how many times have people quoted, you know, you've been born for a time such as this? And there is a lot more to that, and I thought this particular book would be very helpful to all of us, men and women, and it is written by Shannon Bream, The Women of the Bible, the Wisdom of 16 Women and Their Lessons for Today. 8 chapters where she puts together 2 different women, sometimes similar, sometimes very different, to really illustrate a point. And if you're not familiar, Shannon Bream, who we've talked about many times here on Point of View, Kelly Shackelford, of course, joins us every Friday. How many times have we mentioned her on the air? And a variety of other individuals that have been on the program talking about her. She, of course, is the anchor of Fox News at Night, also the chief legal correspondent. This book, Women of the Bible Speak, is certainly one that you will want to read, but also her bestseller, Finding the Bright Side. She's a graduate of Liberty University and an individual that has a law degree from Florida State University, and joins us now by phone. Shannon Bream, great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you so much. It is my privilege to join you.
We're going to work our way through as many of these as we can in this hour. And if nothing else, I appreciated that because, as I said just a few minutes ago, sometimes women are an afterthought, even sometimes in women's conferences. And the way you've put this together, we were talking about this off air, by putting 2 different individuals together. Some of them are contemporaries, like Sarah and Hagar, Mary and Martha, but then you put some together that are actually separated by some length in time, like Esther and Rahab. And I thought it was a fascinating way to actually begin to understand the role that these women had and to see some of their commonality, although obviously they came to some of their conclusions from very different perspectives. And so, if nothing else, kudos for putting together a book that caused all of us to say, hey, that's a new way to look at the whole issue of women in the Bible.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as you said, some of them do know each other and some of them were centuries apart, but we found common threads or common lessons that we thought would encourage people. That was the hope that when I was writing this during the pandemic, everybody and still needs a message of hope and inspiration. And I found a lot of these problems and conflicts were universal over time, and God is universal over time. He was working in them centuries ago. And I want people to be able to realize that he is still working in our lives today in the very same way.
Well, again, we might encourage some of our listeners to pay attention, number 1 to 8. Again, they'll be able to find this book probably in every bookstore. But again, we also have a link so people can get it in Kindle or hardback. But you get number 1 to 8 if you want. And the first one is the one I just alluded to, Sarah and Hagar, Women of the Covenants. In some respects, when we talk about these 2 women, infertility, bitterness, envy, conflict. We start out in Genesis with something which, as you say in your book, doesn't gloss over some of the conflicts and difficulties. If nothing else, it shows the Bible is indeed the Word of God, because anybody from a human point of view trying to write this story wouldn't get us into some of the difficult things of Sarah and Hagar, would they?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, even, leading up to that, we talk about how Abraham a couple of times had to pretend, or he chose to pretend that Sarah was his sister and not his wife, because she was so beautiful, and these leaders were very interested in taking her to be their own wife. I mean, yeah, this is not sanitized. The people of the Bible are flawed as we are. They are human beings. And I find that so encouraging, because all of us have made mistakes, have tried to take things into our own hands, gone our own way, or to suggest to God, look, I've got an even better plan. Let me help you out here, which he clearly doesn't need from us. But these stories show that, and how God still works through it anyway when we're willing to come to him with our mistakes, and to seek his face and to be reconciled. He can work through these things. And the story of Sarah and Hagar, it has things that are uncomfortable and unpleasant, but they're important in looking at the lineage and God's promises to Sarah and Abraham. And, she had struggled with infertility for decades and decades of her life, while she and Abraham had been told that he would have, descendants beyond number, and that she would be the mother of great nations. And so she had to get frustrated along the way, and her great plan was to then, as was often the custom in those days, take one of her servants and send her to Abraham and say, we'll have a child, an heir through this servant. And, digging into the story of Hagar, she didn't have freedom. This wasn't somebody who would have been able to come and go. I mean, she was essentially a slave. So what a very difficult relationship once Hagar becomes pregnant. And, there's jealousy, no doubt there has to be, between Sarah and Hagar. And maybe Hagar thought this would change her standing in the family, or her position to better it. And what she finds is that she's really on the receiving end of very harsh treatment from Sarah, and she runs away. Not once. She's also sent away a second time. But there's just so much strife in this family, and all of us at some time probably have family squabbles and family troubles, and that's what this was on steroids.
Well, again, I love how you started out that section on Hagar, because you said of all the women you're looking at, this is the only non-free person. So it's a reminder again that she was a maidservant, and also that in some respects you see what I call the broken branches of your family tree, because Abraham has trouble telling the truth, Isaac, Jacob. You start seeing a tendency also honoring one or the other. Since I'm older than you, I remember the Smothers Brothers, and one of the lines there was, Mom always liked you best. And you have that kind of theme running through Sarah and Hagar as well, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, goodness, there's so much trouble here, because, they do have this child through Hagar and Abraham. Ishmael comes onto the scene. And we can see that, years later, Sarah's still waiting, and, God gives them a word that they're going to have a child. Sarah's going to be part of this covenant. And she laughs, and she's actually confronted about laughing. And no, I wasn't laughing. But we can't lie to God. He always knows what we're up to. And even when he asks the question in Scripture, we know he knows the answer. So he knows Sarah's pain and frustration over the years for sure. But then she, at the ripe old age of about 90, I believe it is, and Abraham, even older, comes to have a child, which is clearly miraculous. And that's where we see Isaac. But there's still this tension between Ishmael and Isaac and Hagar and Sarah, who will have the inheritance, who will be the, recognized son. So because Sarah went her own way and decided to come up with her own plan, there are consequences to those things. And that we're not shielded from that, and that is not whitewashed away or sanitized away. I mean, there's clearly real trouble and real angst and enmity that comes from that.
And we see that even to this day. We need to take a break, though, and when we come back, since I was talking about rivals, how about rival sisters? And we'll talk about Rachel and Leah, and that will be the second one of the 8 different couplets, if you will, in this book, The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today. Shannon Bream with us, and we'll continue with her right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The pandemic and subsequent lockdowns in 2020 have been devastating to life and livelihoods, but some think it provides a model for what must be done in the future to address the problem of climate change. Some see it as a test run for the new climate-driven economy. That was essentially the argument at the UK Climate Assembly that met last year. One speaker noted that in order to deal with the threat of the virus, the government had to act because they had no choice in the matter. With climate change, they need to act in the same way. A former UN climate chief proposed that government should actually converge the solutions, at least the financial solutions to coronavirus, to the financial solutions for climate. She warned that what we cannot afford to do is to jump out of the frying pan of COVID and into the raging fire of climate change. The problem for these radical environmentalists is selling the idea of permanent climate lockdowns to people already weary of COVID lockdowns. Although Americans say they want action on climate change, they have shown little interest in paying for it. The Biden administration proposed spending the equivalent of $1,500 per American, but the latest Washington Post survey discovered that half the population was unwilling to pay even $24. Of course, it's even debatable whether voters really believe we should aggressively tackle climate change. A recent Gallup poll showed that a quarter wanted action on the pandemic, but only 3% mentioned climate change and the environment as their key concern. Perhaps that is why one European economist admitted that you could not achieve the climate goals currently being proposed without a certain degree of eco-dictatorship. Climate lockdowns might be just the first step of environmental coercion. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Shannon Bream as we talk about her new book, The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today. After each one of the chapter, there are study questions, and I would certainly recommend this to you, not only for individual study, but for those of you that would want to have a Bible study or a small group discussion, just perfect for that. And we spent a little bit of time, of course, talking about the first two, and that would be Sarah and Hagar, now Rachel and Leah, sisters and rivals. And if you're not familiar with the story, of course, it's an account of course, love and deception. Here we see again now with Jacob and jealousy. And the one thing you need to remember is that Leah, as it says in Genesis 29, had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And so that makes a difference in terms of, indeed, the opportunity to think about what this was going to mean and what Laban was going to do to Jacob and a number of others. So, again, you see deception not only in the family line, but outside the family line. But, again, there's some great lessons we can learn, especially in the issue, I would say, Shannon, of sibling rivalry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And listen, this is one of those things that translates, I think, across the centuries. These ideas of betrayal and sibling rivalry, these two sisters that Jacob, it was sort of love at first sight for him when he saw Rachel, and he agreed to work for her 7 years to be able to marry her. And when that time was up, instead of sending Rachel to him after all the wedding festivities and celebrations, Laban, his father-in-law, sent in Leah, who apparently had, fewer prospects, and, sent her in Jacob later realizes, oh, I've married the other sister, goes back to Laban furious, and Laban says, well, here's the deal. You can work 7 more years, but I'll let you go ahead and marry Rachel in a week. So listen, Jacob had been familiar with double-crossing people. He had pulled off some scams of his own, so this feels like a little bit of payback for him. But then we see this real struggle between the sisters in that Leah, who was not the, quote, loved wife or cherished wife, is the one who has children, which was such a blessing, seen as very much a blessing from God in those days for women to be blessed with children, with heirs. While Rachel struggled, she did not have children for a very long time, and we see her frustration, and we see a very real marital squabble between Jacob and Rachel when she's like, I don't have children. You must help me, something. And he says, well, I'm not God. I mean, I can't solve this for you. But we see her frustration and her misery over that. And it's very interesting to me to study the names of the children who came along. And we can see that Leah is so longing for Jacob to love her. And she names these sons with names like, maybe this time he will love me. My husband will be attached to me. Well, Rachel continues to scheme and plot and try everything that she can to have children. Well, eventually we're told God hears her prayers. He sees her. And she begins to have children as well. But there have been years and years of rivalry, jealousy, and hurt between these sisters. And Jacob caught right in the middle.
Well, again, it's just a great piece because, as you said, that transcends the centuries for sure. And just another example that I think anybody that has had siblings or other individuals that maybe in one way or another there's jealousy or there's rivalry or there's competition certainly relates to that. But so that we get through all 8, I'm going to keep moving because one of the other surprises is I thought, okay, when we get to Tamar and Ruth, how do we fit that? Well, you called it as outsiders. And there were a couple of surprises in the chapter here, and that was one of those. I thought, how would you put those together? Well, in a sense, they're outsiders, and that's an issue as well, because how many times has somebody felt like an outsider? That's somewhat true in the 21st century, but that was certainly true in the ancient world. If you were seen as an outsider, outside the clan, outside of the family, certainly outside of the divine land and the covenant, that could be very significant. But in both of these cases, we can learn some lessons of what they did as outsiders. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, and wind up in the lineage of Christ, our Savior. Both these women who were not originally part of the nation of Israel, they were outsiders. Ruth, if we remember the story, her mother-in-law, Naomi, their family had come to Moab. They'd left Judea, and they had, while they were there, Naomi, her sons had married these 2 women. Well, unfortunately, Naomi and both daughter-in-laws all become widows. Naomi loses her husband and her 2 sons. So she decides to return home and says to these young women, don't come with me. You're still young. You can go marry into another family and have your own family. Well, Ruth refuses to leave her, and those are the words we hear in so many beautiful wedding ceremonies. Entreat me not to leave you. Your people, my people. Your God will be my God. And that's Ruth following Naomi back. And we see through a series of events that they're destitute. They don't have a male provider in those days. That was very, very critical for survival. But because Naomi and Ruth are both faithful, Boaz, who is a distant relative of Naomi's, actually comes to take great mercy on Ruth and decides that she presents herself to him as a possibility for marriage in a very modest, understated way. There is another kinsman between them that could have redeemed Ruth. He bows out, and Boaz takes her as his wife. So she then is married into this lineage in the body of Christ. And it's a beautiful story of redemption and bringing in an outsider. Tamar's story is a little bit more saucy. And, we included this story, and I've done a few podcasts on this. I had my mom, who is my Christian mentor and model, and said, Mom, who do you want to talk about from the book? And she said, I'll take Tamar because I don't think anybody else will. So she takes the story of Tamar, who is widowed twice. And there's a 3rd son. The tradition would have been to give her the 3rd son to marry, to create an heir for her original husband. And her father-in-law is like, oh, I don't know about this. And he sends her away back to her family. She comes to realize he's probably not going to give her that 3rd son. And she makes a very questionable double-crossing decision to pose as a prostitute, sleep with her father-in-law. He then does not know it's her, later becomes enraged when he finds out this daughter-in-law of his is pregnant, calls her in and wants her to be burned to death. She quietly sends along the staff and the ring that he left with her when he slept with this prostitute for payment, signaling to him the person whose these things belong to, that's the father of this child. And he says, you know what? She's more valuable than I am. She's more righteous than I am, because she doesn't publicly shame him, which she clearly makes her point. And he realizes that he's not done right by her by withholding that third son. And she has twins. And again, this ends up in the lineage of Christ. So outsiders with very different stories, but the common theme is they come into the family of God, as we all are outsiders and come in to be his children.
Well, again, it is an incredible story, and it illustrates again that the Bible is the work of God, not the work of human hands, because some of these stories would never have been put into the Old Testament. And that one in particular, like you said, pretty scandalous, saucy, whatever phrase you want to use, certainly fits into that category. And I think it is a good point, before we take a break, is that you find these individuals in the lineage of Christ. We come back from the break, we're going to get into some others, and you think about Rahab. Well, you find her in Hebrews 11, the Hebrew Hall of Faith. So in some respects, even though we might say these are not the people that you would want to necessarily have as your role models for your daughter or your niece, nevertheless, these are individuals who, if they faithfully served, actually then show up in the New Testament, even though we're spending most of our time talking about women in the Old Testament. When we come back from the break, we'll get into women of valor. That will be Deborah and Yael. You probably are not familiar with them as much, but that's why we have Shannon here to educate all of us about that. And then we will get into a couple of others, Hannah and Miriam. We've already been talking about infertility, and certainly that is another aspect of Hannah. Years ago when I wrote a book on genetic engineering, I thought I'd hear from people asking questions about genetics. Instead, I was hearing from all the modern-day Hannahs who were infertile and wondering, what is God doing in my life, because we were talking about artificial insemination and things of that nature. So the pain there, which we will be talking about as well. And then we'll get into Esther and Rahab and some of the others. So there is some great material that's all available in this book, The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today. If you're looking for the book in your local bookstore, you'll probably be able to find it. If you can't find it, or you would just like to order it right away, we have made it very easy for you to do. Just click on the point of view picture there of Shannon Bream, and you will see that the book is already out, and you can either click on hardcover or Kindle and get a copy there if you would like to do so. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to get into a couple of other of these very important women, some lessons we can learn, even though this happened a long time ago. Humanity and human behavior are a constant, and I think we can learn some very important vicarious lessons about how to live as believers and how to learn maybe some of these lessons from those who made some bad choices, in some cases made some good choices, and provide us with models that we can apply in the future. The new book out, and I think you will enjoy it. The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today, and we'll continue our conversation with Shannon Bream right after this. No point.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Shannon Bream as we talk about her book, The Women of the Bible Speak. And again, 16 women and their lessons for today. And we've talked about Sarah and Hagar, Rachel and Leah, Tamar and Ruth. thought we would focus now on the book of Judges, Deborah and Yael. First of all, Deborah, of course, at a time when in the Judges, Israel had departed from truth, and we see that. And then Yael, which basically means mountain goat, engaged in pretty violent activities. So again, these aren't ones that we know so much about because they tend not to be the ones we cover in Bible studies. But Shannon, you focused some time and attention on these two women of valor.
Yeah, I love that we included these because Deborah is this picture of leadership and of great faith and obedience. And she was leading the nation of Israel. They came to her as a respected judge to resolve their disputes and to guide the nation as it stood at that point. So they're being oppressed by the Canaanites terribly at that point. And God comes to Deborah and says, you're to gather the men and go into battle against the Canaanites. So she goes and calls her military leader of Israel, Barak, and she tells him the plan, and we see some hesitance with them because, listen, on paper, this was not a smart matchup. It was not good for Israel. And he says, I'll do it, but only if you go with me. He knows she's anointed. And she says, okay, we're going to do this. But because of your hesitance, the opposing general, Sisera, is actually going to be delivered into the hands of a woman. And I used to always think when I heard that story when I was earlier that it was Deborah. And it's not actually her, which is how we get to meet Yael later in the chapter and later in the story. But listen, the Canaanites were known for things like 900 chariots that they had, all of these kinds of, weaponry and things that Israel did not have. And there was some hesitance of some of the tribes of Israel to get involved with this thing, but they eventually get the men together. They go into battle. And I love one of the details is that their faithful Deborah goes in with them to lead them with Barak. And God sends rain that is so heavy that the chariots are stuck. They're useless. Those 900 beautiful chariots, they can't even use them. Israel completely routs the Canaanites. No one is left except for Sisera, who is that opposing general of the Canaanites. He goes running off and goes to a place where he thinks he'll be able to hide and take some refuge. That's where he comes across Yael. And she says, oh, come into my tent. You can rest in here. She gives him milk. She gives him a chance to take a nap. And then she murders him. She takes a tent peg and drives it through his temple. She ends up being the woman who actually fulfills the prophecy that Sisera would be delivered into the hands of a woman. And we see that Deborah goes on. She's also something that would have been like a worship leader. She leads the Israelites in this beautiful song of victory.
Yes.
She continually turns the praise back to God, praising God for giving them this victory. So these women are very faithful in something that on paper did not look good for them, but Deborah didn't hesitate. And I aspire to have that kind of obedience and that kind of faith.
Well, again, leave a legacy, too, because who comes after Deborah? Gideon. And again, another great story there as well, and all the hesitation. There's a lot there, but I'm going to, again, keep it moving because I want to get to Hannah and Miriam. And as you point out, this one is kind of interesting because, as I pointed out, sometimes they're contemporaries, as we just talked about. In this case, Miriam goes all the way back to Moses. Hannah is, of course, the mother of Samuel at a time when the priests are not exactly the most exemplary type. But you bring these two women together because they're both speaking God's truth. Can you explain that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and both of them we see are put in a position to give up a loved one, someone they loved very much. And for Miriam, she is there as the older sister to Moses at a time when Pharaoh has said, every one of the Hebrew babies that are being born, the males have to be thrown in the Nile to die. They were beginning to outnumber or to increase in number so much that the Egyptians were threatened by them. And there were some real serious issues. They were oppressing the Israelites. And so we see that, I love this detail in the Bible as well, that the midwives who have gone to the Hebrew women, the babies are living and surviving. And there's sort of these questions about what's happening. And the midwives are like, oh, these Hebrew women have their babies so quickly, we can't even get there to stop the process. Where clearly they're allowing these babies to live. We're told that Moses' parents saw him as a special child. They hid him for a while, but then they put together a little thatched basket and send Miriam to send him into the Nile, which to me is such a beautiful picture in that the Nile is where these babies were supposed to be going to their death, and many of them did. But for Moses, it was life because Pharaoh's daughter is there bathing with her group of women in the Nile. She hears the baby, takes mercy on him. Miriam is the brave little girl who, is probably a young teen, maybe, or even younger, who steps up to say, hi, let me help you with this baby. Pharaoh's daughter says she's going to take it in. Miriam says, well, would you like me to have a Hebrew woman nurse him for a while? And in that tradition, 2 or 3 years. And Pharaoh's daughter says yes. So she's able to now, Miriam, run back to her family with baby Moses and say, guess what? We're going to get to keep him a while longer. So he gets these deep roots of his Hebrew background before he's raised then in Pharaoh's palaces. And it's such an important part of his grounding to when he is later called hesitantly to lead them out of Egypt and on the Exodus. So we see through Miriam's life, too, later on, she and Aaron, the siblings of Moses, are jealous. And they speak out in their jealousy against Moses. And there is some serious payment that God renders on Miriam. And Moses goes to ask for mercy for her. But she's an esteemed prophetess and leader in her own right among the Israeli people and nation as it existed then. So we see a very full picture of her. And for Hannah, we see that for years and years, she's plagued by infertility and goes on these yearly trips to the temple to beg God, pour out. Listen, he knows all of our troubles, but there's something in being vulnerable and laying them at his feet. And now Eli, the priest, sees her and gets the wrong impression and is sort of, hey, woman, you can't be drunk in here in your babblings in the temple. And she says, no, I'm praying, pouring out my heart to God for such a need. She doesn't tell him, but he says, okay, go and be blessed. And she does become pregnant with Samuel, who is such a key prophet, and later recognizes David to be the king of Israel. And the thing is, she had told God, I will give this child back to you. So she takes Samuel back after his weaning and gives him to Eli and leaves this young boy there to say, this boy has been given in service to God as I promised. And again, we see somebody giving up someone they love very much to go into God's service and for his plan.
And again, we've seen modern day examples of parents being willing to give up their children to go to the mission field or to go into ministry, and just some great application. But just before we take a break, I thought we would pick out one more, and that is Esther and Rahab. Of course, you can camp out at Esther because we're talking about Haman and Mordecai and all the rest. But again, these are two very different individuals, but you put them together because in both cases, you describe them as unexpected heroes of the faith.
Right, and they both were placed exactly where God needed them to be in moments where they had to have courage and step up and to give a great victory to the Jewish people. And for Esther, there were so many details and little twists and turns that I had kind of forgotten over the years. And digging back into the story, I was just blown away again by all the providential steps that God had taken to have her in the right place. And listen, we know her for stepping up to save the people, her Jewish people. But what I want to remind people of, too, is there was a moment of hesitance. She was human and that she was fearful, knowing if she went to the king, the law in those days was if you showed up and he didn't want to see you, you could be killed on sight. And she knew that, but she decided, she asked the people all to fast with her for 3 days and then said, if I perish, I perish. And she went to him and obviously had great favor through God's divine intervention, the king's favor on her to save the entire group of the Jewish people who were scattered all over the place and all over the kingdom of Persia. And Rahab as well, a prostitute, not part of the family of Israel, although she later became part of the family of Israel. When the spies came to Jericho to scope things out, she knew and recognized their God as the God. And she risked her own life as well to cover for them, to help them so that they were able to come back and have a victory in Jericho. So these women, in the right place at the right time, but also stepped up with courage when they needed to.
And again, you find Rahab in Hebrews 11, in James 2, and other passages. And as we pointed out earlier, we have some that end up being in the lineage of Jesus. And you can see that, for example, in Matthew and in Luke. And then in this particular case with Rahab, shows up of all places in what we call the Hebrew Hall of Faith. So let's, if we can, take a break. And when we come back, we'll pick out just two more real quickly. But we've talked about Sarah and Hagar, women of the covenants, Rachel and Leah, sisters and rivals, Tamar and Ruth, all about outsiders, Deborah and Yael, women of valor, Hannah and Miriam, speaking God's truth and also being willing to give up your son, and then Esther and Rahab, unexpected heroes of faith. When we come back, we'll work our way into the New Testament. That's Mary and Martha in Bethany. And again, we could spend an hour on that one easily. And then also Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene. And then a final chapter on Jesus and the women. So just an outstanding book, which I think would be so good for individual study, but also for group study, because there are discussion questions at the end of each one of these particular sections, giving you a chance to think about this, maybe have a discussion. And so if you're leading a small group or maybe a Bible study, you might want to seriously think about this book by Shannon Bream, The Women of the Bible Speak, Wisdom of 16 Women and Their Lessons for Today. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Shannon Bream with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about her book, The Women of the Bible Speak. And we move to the New Testament. And, of course, how many sermons over the years have we heard about Mary and Martha living in Bethany, of course, witnessing one of the greatest miracles, the raising of their brother. But here you talk about, Shannon, the two pathways. And this one probably is familiar territory for so many of us that have been in church, because we recognize the striking difference between Mary and Martha, both sisters, but choosing different paths. And talk about some of the insights that you were able to glean from that passage or two.
Yeah, the passage we think of so often with these sisters of Lazarus is when Jesus is there and they're hosting him and they're studying, and Martha is running around preparing and waiting on people, and she actually pulls Jesus into this thing at some point, says, why don't you tell Mary to help me? And Jesus is like, listen, she's chosen the better thing, which she is there studying at my feet, and I'm not going to take that away from her. Now, he doesn't tell Martha she's doing something bad, and the thing is, we can be in service, and that is a very good thing. But to me, the lesson from that was, if it's about being in service and being busy and doing things that are good versus actually spending time with Christ in relationship and in learning from him, I feel like what Jesus was saying is that really should be our priority. Not that one is wrong or right. They're both good things, positive things in our lives, but really the time with him and the time in relationship and growing is really going to be the better if you're choosing between those two. And there's so much about Jesus that wasn't part of the norm or the customs of the day. And it's part of the reason the religious leaders really didn't like him. And I think to see this picture of Mary studying with him as the men were studying with his teacher, that wouldn't have been traditionally how things would have been working in those days, that the religious and advanced education would have been mostly men studying with religious teachers. But I think it's beautiful that we see Christ has women who are in ministry to him, who are part of his inner circle and friendships, clearly communicating that they are valued and respected, just as Mary was in this situation. And Martha, too. I think that, he's not telling her she's doing something wrong, but just that Mary has chosen the better.
And again, this illustrates something which later on you get into in one of your other chapters in Jesus and Women, because Jesus really did elevate women. There's not well, you're a woman, you shouldn't be listening, but if anything, she's chosen the better thing. But the last two individuals that you talk about are Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene. And you use that as a great illustration of the witnesses to the gospel. Again, coming from two different set of circumstances, but finding themselves together, both in the ministry and then after the resurrection.
Yeah, and I'd always spent so much time on Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the early years. I mean, when the angel comes to her with this divine assignment, that you think most of us would freak out if an angel showed up. But she's this young woman who certainly has questions. How will this be? But she doesn't shy away or run away from this assignment to take on being the earthly mother of Christ in the human form. And so I've always been very focused on that part of the story. But in looking at her life, and I thought it was important to follow through to see her along the points of being a mother to Jesus, being part of his ministry or being there in key parts of his ministry, but to also remember that she was there at the crucifixion. And I cannot imagine seeing your child falsely accused, beaten and tortured and killed while you are powerless and are watching this. But she was there for every moment. She never shied away from that. And the fact that she was with the disciples, too, in prayer in the upper room, the early part of the church, after the crucifixion, we see that she is there with them, still boldly part of the faith and being part of laying the early foundations of the church. So instead of just seeing her as this young, probably teen girl with this overwhelming assignment, which is important, I thought also to follow through on her life as well.
Well, and again with Mary, I was going to say with Mary Magdalene, now you've finished the couplet, because then you have the angel, and she's saying they've taken the Lord away and we don't know where he is, and then she is witness to the resurrection.
Right. She's essentially sent out as the first Christian evangelist, having been the one that Christ reveals himself to, and she runs to share the good news.
So again, I think you've at least focused on those 8 chapters, but at the very end, you talk about Jesus and the women, because you remind us that there are other women that he's run into, the woman caught in adultery, woman in need, and a variety of others. And so as we kind of come to the end of this conversation, in some respects, we can understand, as I've said before, how women really in that culture were demeaned and were not seen as important. But as we look at certainly both the Old Testament and especially how Jesus treated women in the New Testament, it was an elevation of them in the midst of a culture that actually never paid attention to those women.
Yeah, I mean, and he saw them, he spoke to them, he said their names, he saw them in their pain. You mentioned the woman caught in adultery. We all have heard that story about, he who is without sin cast the first stone, and nobody was able to stay. They all left, and Christ said, they don't condemn you, neither do I. Now go and turn from your sin, but I don't condemn you as a human being. It was the same conversation, or at least the same theme or feeling that we see in his conversation with the Samaritan woman who was living in shame. He did not browbeat and embarrass publicly these women or condemn them with judgment. He did say to turn from your sin, but he accepted them with great compassion and saw them for who they were, had a conversation with them, built a relationship with them in those moments. And I think that's a beautiful thing to see. He clearly treated women with respect, and even those who were outcast from society gave them complete and total acceptance for the human beings that they were.
Well, again, this book is about 220 pages, very readable. Of course, it takes you through so many ideas, and it's one of the inaugural books, I believe, in the Fox News book series. But Shannon, just before we let you go, let's talk about how people can use this, because at the end of each one of these sections, there are discussion questions, and I know that many people that listen to this program might want to study this individually, but a number of others might be small group leaders, Bible study leaders, and you've put this together in such a way that you can take a number of weeks to study through this book and read it together.
Yeah, I love study questions. I like, kind of having a guide to go a little bit deeper to figure out the personal applications to these things. Because like I said, these problems are timeless, and I think these struggles are timeless for men and women. But here, of course, the book specifically focused on women. So I love a question that will make me think more deeply about the scripture, maybe give me some cross-references, maybe, just take me a little bit deeper into thinking, okay, now what can I learn from this about God's faithfulness or his protection or his answers, and apply it in my own life. So I love doing those alone, but I think the group idea is wonderful as well. I've had people say to me, I got it from my sisters and my mom or from my Bible study group, and we're going to do it together. Because I learned from discussion with other people and their perspectives and how the Lord has spoken to them through these stories and scriptures as well. So, I hope it'll spark conversation and just take things a little bit deeper for folks that they can see these same things working in their own lives.
Well, again, we just appreciate the fact that you took the time not only to write the book, which is very well done, but to give us an hour here on Point of View. I mentioned earlier, Finding the Bright Side, The Art of Chasing What Matters. And, of course, this new book that's just come out, The Women of the Bible Speak, the Wisdom of 16 Women and Their Lessons for Today. And, Shannon, it has been a delight to have you on the program, and hope we can do it again sometime.
Kirby, it has been my privilege. Thank you so much, and I do hope we'll speak again.
Well, again, great material. If you find yourself saying, well, I might want to get a copy of that book, it has been endorsed by just kind of a who's who of individuals we've had on this program, people like Max Lucado and Michael W. Smith and a variety of others. And so I think you will certainly enjoy the conversation and the book and even the discussion that might ensue as a result of reading through these chapters and discussing them. So Shannon Bream's been with us, and I hope that you'll take the time to find out more on our website at pointofview.net. Of course, you can follow her on Facebook, Twitter, and a variety of other things. And as busy as she is, it meant a lot that she would give us an hour today, because she's going to be actually getting ready for a broadcast herself. So I hope that you enjoyed the conversation here. And most importantly, I want to say thank you to Doug for helping us engineer today, and for Steve for producing this. And I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.